Welcome everybody this morning. Lovely to see you all. And thank you for joining us at the inaugural Marcus Garvey Memorial Lecture. We are so pleased that we have everybody here. There's a fantastic panel of speakers. We have some fantastic food from our friends at Golden Krust in the Bronx. They've told us to make sure that you tell a friend to go visit them there. So we will make sure that we pass that on to everybody. Folks, this symposium is held in recognition of the Caribbean icon, human rights champion, and Pan-African giant Marcus Garvey. Garvey was declared Jamaica's first national hero in 1964, but as many of us know, he was a resident celebrity here in Harlem for many years. This lecture series was designed to commemorate his first lecture here in New York, which happened on or around May 9th in 1916. And I do want to take a moment to recognize our good friend and brother, Mr. Stephen Golden, who organized this lecture series and brought us all here together. Stephen is the president of the Jamaica UNIA-ACL, as we all know, right? The Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Community League. One aim, one God, one aim, one destiny. All right. So without further ado, let's dive into the program. We've had a wonderful opening by our drummer, Mr. Atiba Wilson. So thank you, brother Atiba. Ashe to you. And from here, we'll go to the most righteous Reverend Kobe Little for our invocation.
Good morning, my sisters and brothers.
Good morning.
An invocation is an appeal. It is the citing of an authority. And so this morning I rise to offer an invocation to set the tone for this conversation. I rise in the context of the contemporary world in which we live, a world where democracy is under a very real threat, a world where white supremacy still runs rampant around the globe, a world where African people are disconnected and disunited, a world where there are those in Europe, Asia, and the Americas who seek to continue to convene the Berlin Conference and to extract Africa's people and resources for the benefit of others, but not for the benefit of Africa. I rise in the context of a building movement for reparations. And so in this context today, we invoke our Creator, the original ancestor. And we invoke our Creator, we invite our Creator to fill this space. One, to remind us of who we are. We are an African people. Two, we invite our Creator to this space to remind us whose we are and what our charge is. Our charge is to love justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly. And we must, as proponents of justice, build the movement for reparations. So I rise to invoke the Spirit of our Creator to give us that remembrance and also to give us the faith and the encouragement and to remind us of the historical record. All of our movement for justice, all of our movement for power, all of our movement for freedom has been a movement fueled and undergirded by the practice of our faith in its many, many, many manifestations. So this morning we rise to invoke the spirit of our original ancestor, but we also rise to invoke the spirit of our ancestors general. Those people who created African culture, those people who were captured, kidnapped, trafficked, tortured, murdered, raped, abused, enslaved, forced to work, forced to face the elements, deprived of their resources, deprived of their wages, deprived of the benefit of their labor, deprived of the connection to their communities and our families. We invoke the spirit of those ancestors. But we also invoke the spirit of the ancestors who resisted the trafficking, the torture, the enslavement, and the degradation and disrespect. We invoke the spirit of those freedom fighters whose work brought us to this day. And then, from the whirlwind of the great African diaspora, we invoke the spirit of the Right Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey. Let us have a brief word of prayer. And as we pray, we give thanks to our Creator and the ancestors for the presence of our leader, the Honorable Leonard Jeffries. Oh, magnificent Creator, you who formed us, you who created us, you who are the power of all powers, we invite you into this place. We invite you into our hearts. We invite you into this conversation. Come, O Lord, with our ancestors. Come, O Lord, with those who paved the road that we now travel. Come, O Lord, with those who bled and labored and died that we might live. Come and be with us. Lift us up as we seek to proclaim one God, one aim, one destiny. Come, Lord, as we seek to unite. Come, Lord, as we seek to build this meeting by the campfire. Come, Lord, as we seek to repair that which has been broken. Come, Lord, as we seek to offer ideas to advance our struggle. Bless now our program. Bless now our cause. Bless now our speakers is our prayer. In the name of love, in the name of unity, in the name of Africa, we ask this prayer. Let all of us say Ashe.
Ashe.
Amen, and thank you. Let's give a round of applause for Reverend Little. As usual, very inspirational words, and it's truly magnificent how the ancestors work, because we were literally talking about the Honorable Dr. Jeffries last night at dinner.
And this morning.
And this morning as well, so we're truly honored to have you in our presence, Dr. Jeffries. Next, we will be very fortunate to have greetings from Dr. Ron Daniels. Dr. Ron, are you prepared to join us here at the podium? I'll give you a second to come on up. Thank you, Dr. Daniels.
Thank you.
All right.
Hotep.
Out to the people.
It is a blessing. Glad that we caught up with our Paramount Chief, Dr. Leonard Jeffries. I call him my Paramount Chief. I gave him that name because he is our Paramount Chief. Now, our Paramount Chief has issues because he don't clear his telephone up, so I've been trying to reach him for about 3 weeks or more to check on him, see how he's doing and whatever. So you got to get clear your stuff out, bro. Right? But that's Dr. Leonard Jeffries. Give him another round of applause. And let me apologize, sisters and brothers. I'm delighted to be here on this auspicious occasion, the first annual lecture on behalf of the Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey. Very appropriate. and I'll talk more about that in a minute. But I wear several hats, and I bring greetings from the Institute of the Black World 21st Century, first and foremost, but also the National African American Reparations Commission. And in that capacity, in about an hour or so, I have to convene the HR 40 strategy group. As was been referenced by our moderator, reparations is surging at a level that I would not have believed in my lifetime. And we're knocking on the door. In fact, Kobe, you and I had a long conversation yesterday about how to get HR 40 over the top. HR 40 will create a commission, not only to study, but to create reparations proposals for African Americans. So we're not just studying. Now, I also have to say that we are delighted that our host, Senator Cordell Cleare, who's not here with us, but we have to give her acknowledgement even in absentia, was very much involved in helping to create the New York State Reparations Commission. We are about to launch a full inquiry in the state of New York about the question of slavery, not down south, but up south, right here in the state of New York, with California having preceded us. And of course, the city of Evanston, Illinois, having been certified by the National African American Reparations Commission as a replicable model for reparations, because it is happening in Evanston, Illinois. So we are in season and on time. I also want to acknowledge with our dear beloved brother Stephen Golding being here all the way from Jamaica, and someone that I remember is not only being a part of the Reparations Commission there. We just recently had a meeting in Evanston where, again, you were represented at the State of the Black World Conference, but also a champion for the Rastafari. You know, the people have sometimes forgotten them. You have been among those who have said, no, we dare not do that. So we really honor you for that. But I also want to point out, yes. I also want to point out that we have a synergistic relationship, by we, the National African American Reparations Committee, a synergistic relationship with the CARICOM Reparations Commission. I'm telling you, brothers and sisters, if you don't know it, reparations is fulfilling Professor Hilary Beckles' prophecy. And if you don't know Professor Hilary Beckles, you should know him. He is the public intellectual. He is the intellectual guru, if you will, of the global reparations movement. He's a bad brother, strong and capable. He sort of provided the backdrop for those Caribbean leaders who took the position in 2014 that to challenge the former colonial powers to, in fact, provide reparations for native enslavement and native genocide and African enslavement. And so we are really on the move in that regard. And I am so delighted we have this strong relationship between the National African American Reparations Commission and the CARICOM Reparations Commission. In fact, Beckles jumps on me because I say how influential it is. I'm talking about in this period. It has been the most visionary step taken. And we have followed their lead. CARICOM Reparations Commission has a 10-point program. We have a 10-point program that is being studied all over the world. Reparations, as our sister Kichi Taifa would say, is on fire. It's happening. And it's a good thing. And again, this lecture takes place within the context of that event. I would be remiss if I did not, in that context, also uphold one of the great revolutionaries of our time, Don Rojas. Don Rojas, who served as the press secretary for Maurice Bishop, but much more than that, is a true revolutionary in terms of not only his humility, but his vision, his capabilities, and all those. He would be here except that, he is suffering from multiple myeloma, and we ask you to continue to pray for him. We have kept him away from death's doorstep by our prayers and his activity. I do believe that it is his activity which has in fact had him stay alive. And I see our host has arrived. Senator Cordell Cleare is here. Let's give her another round of applause. And in that regard, invoke the name of Bill Perkins. We all know that she is the successor, an able, capable successor of Bill Perkins And Bill Perkins was a bad brother also. Let me conclude quickly by saying the following. I was mentored by Queen Mother Moore, literally. And Queen Mother Moore said that she was a brain surgeon. She said her mission was to operate on constipated minds. And as a young master's degree student, leaving from Youngstown, Ohio to go to Albany to the Graduate School of Public Affairs, full of myself, I was one who had a constipated brain. I didn't even know what reparations was. Thank God I met Queen Mother Moore. She operated, and I hope she's proud that I stand as someone who was at the center of the global reparations movement. But I'm here to say that Queen Mother Moore is dancing. Callie House is dancing. John Conyers, we need to raise his name, is dancing. And generations of those who have fought for reparations are dancing because reparations is alive and well. And it is so important because if we understand what reparations is about, it is not just the awarding of some cash and a check. Let's not reduce it to that level of commonness. It is no less than the actual repair of the damages inflicted on African people across the centuries, but much more than that. It is about cleansing the U.S. and global systems of the infection of white supremacy and racism and all of the malignancies that have come with the kind of imposition on the transatlantic slave trade that took place in terms of the values. We have come to offer, as Dr. Julius Garvey said, an alternative vision of what the world must be and what it can be based and rooted on our own African culture, our own African worldview. And Dr. Jeffries, for years and years and years, has been a proponent of having us to look in that regard. And so I really want us to uphold the Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey. And one of the things that I would hope people would join in is that I have proposed for many, many years, with the blessing actually of Dr. Julius Garvey. And let me just quickly say something about Haiti as we go as well. Got to say something about Haiti. We're working on Haiti because we all of us owe a debt to Haiti for shattering the myth of white supremacy at the height of the propagation of that monstrous idea. Haiti shattered the myth of white supremacy, been punished ever since, and it is at a deep crisis right now, but we're working on that crisis, and there is hope. But we can never, ever, ever give up on working to liberate Haiti, because when Haiti is liberated, we will all be liberated, and this powerful nation will stand, as Dr. Milano Karinga was saying, out on the stage of history, so pretty proud of the productive nation. So let's give it up for Haiti as well. But I've also proposed for many, many years that this flag, the universal African flag, this flag, that Garvey intended to be the flag not just for black people in this country. There's a misnomer that somehow this is the black liberation flag of African Americans. No, that was not the intent. It is the universal, unifying flag for all African people. So one of the things that I have proposed, and I hope, Brother Golding and others, that you will join in, is that on August 17th, that by self-determination, Kuja Chagalia, we declare it Universal African Flag Day. We should fly it all the time. But if you're in New York and various places, you know that on Puerto Rican flag, they be waving their stuff. Whenever they're parade, they be waving their stuff. So I'm saying at least one day, your August 17th, we ought to do what? Be waving the universal African flag. Everywhere. By the millions, we should see this flag waving as a proclamation of who we are and as an evidence that Marcus Garvey is still in the whirlwind.
That's right.
And in the storm. And that we are his children and that we have become that which he hopes and had hoped that we would be. So again, I just dropped by. I'm sorry I have to run and move and on, but I have to say, as Garvey would say, up you mighty race. Up you mighty race. Up you mighty race. You can accomplish what you will. And let me just say a bit about that in terms of faith. See, people took that lightly. He said, what you will. You saw me. No. What he's saying is, we have the power, if we believe, to accomplish what we will. We can will the victory.
That's right.
If we believe.
That's right.
And that's what the Honorable Marcus Garvey said. We should never ever, the greatest mass organizer and visionary we have ever produced as an African people. And no one, everybody should know about the Honorable Marcus Garvey, and hence the relevance of this lecture. So thank you very much, Brother Golden. If you would step here, I want to give you these documents. I want to present them to you. This is from the State of the Black World Conference. History of the Black World, 21st Century.
Come join us. We're going to take a quick picture of this proclamation and then with you as well.
I want to make sure you have these, and this is our work on Grenada that Don Rojas is very much involved in, and I just want you to have these because these are kind of the legacy work of Garvey. Dr. Julius Garvey is all over these documents as well. And again, we welcome you, and we appreciate the work that you're doing, and we certainly appreciate our senator for joining us. Sure. I already told him about how you helped make the reparations thing happen in New York.
All right, guys.
Beautiful.
Two.
Bad sister.
You got it? Okay.
Wait, thank you very much.
One more.
And then he'll probably. Got you. All right.
Thank you. Please give a round of applause again for Dr. Daniels. When you speak of will, you definitely have to recognize our incredible state senator, Cordell Cleare. She is not only a dedicated public servant, but is a Harlem resident, a Harlem native, and has been in the trenches and in Albany. Some people would call Albany the trenches too. Fighting for us. So please, if you please give a proper greeting and a round of applause for our state senator.
Listen, I'm sure I don't have much more to add. You know, Ron Daniels, he's the one, and there's so many others in this room. Dr. Jeffries, all the dignitaries that are here today. Welcome and thank you for being here. You know, today's topic is reparations now, right? And it could not be more important or timely given that we now finally, after hundreds of years, on the precipice of considering real reparations and remedies here in New York State. You know, I remember when I first got in the Senate, it was one of the things that I knew I wanted to follow up on right away, and I started agitating immediately. And one of my white colleagues said to me, you know, slavery didn't hardly take place in New York. And I said, excuse me? Yes, it did. And not only that, New York and the rest of this country benefited greatly from the cotton industry and from slavery that did take place in other states, including slave trading, slave ship building. All of these things brought profit to the state, and in addition to that, New York State, as we all know, did have slaves. So as I stated on the floor of the Senate in 2023, the plight faced by Black people in this country is painfully distinct from others. Slavery may have officially ended in New York on or about July 5th, 1827, and that's New York State, but equality did not reign the next day. This bill is needed and demanded by many in my Senate district who feel that amends must be made, reparations provided before we do anything else as a public body, and I agree with them. And I agree because reparations is about a few things. It's not just one thing. It is about, first of all, acknowledging that you did something wrong and apologizing. That is important. I need that apology, and I need you to know that what you did was wrong. And then it's about compensation and the many forms that that can take, right? And then it's also about ensuring that this will never happen again. And those three things have to be worked on as we approach. Fortunately, we did pass that bill and just appropriated $5 million in this year's New York State budget to fund the work of the commission. no point in forming commissions that can't work. You need money. Which should hold its first meeting on or about in the area of Juneteenth of this year.
All right.
So our collective job now is mobilizing our community to show up and show out to all the upcoming events, the meetings, the hearings, and opportunities to comment must be taken. We're blessed to be joined by an expert panel today, which includes one of the 9 members of the New York State Community Commission on Reparations Remedies. And you just heard from Dr. Ron Daniels of the National African American Reparations Commission. And he's joined by Reverend Kobe Little, there you go, Maryland State NAACP President Laura Trevelyan, I hope I didn't mess that up. Okay, Trevelyan, Heirs of Slavery co-founder, and Stephen Golding, UNIA-ACL Jamaica President. So the New York State Community Commission of Reparations on Reparations Remedies was signed into law on the 19th of December 2023, and the next steps are as follows. The effective date of the act is immediate, so it is now law, and all of the provisions can take place without any waiting period other than limits prescribed in the bill itself. Within 90 days of the effective date, the 9 members of the commission shall be appointed. That has happened. The date that all 9 were appointed was on February 29th, 2024. Real living history.
Okay.
Yeah. The 9 members are Jennifer Jones Austin is the CEO of and Executive Director of Federation of Protestant Welfare Agencies, an anti-poverty policy and advocacy nonprofit with 170 member organizations. Timothy Hogue serves as a Commissioner for the Department of Civil Service and President of the Civil Service Commission. Linda Brown Robinson, who is the immediate past president of the Syracuse Onondaga NAACP. Derek Hamilton, PhD, is a university professor, the Henry Cohen Professor of Economics and Urban Policy, and the founding director of the Institute of Race, Power, and Political Economy at the New School. Linda Tarrant Reed is an author, historian, freelance journalist, photographer, and community activist. And Dr. Shawnell Hawkins serves as the president and chief executive officer of the Urban League of Rochester, an affiliate of the National Urban League. Of course, once again, Dr. Ron Daniels is founder and president of the Institute of the Black World 21st Century, IBW, a progressive, African-centered, action-oriented resource center dedicated to empowering people of African descent and marginalized communities. Lori Daniel Favors, Esquire, is the executive director at the Center for Law and Social Justice at Medgar Evers College, and Reverend Dr. Deborah D. Jenkins, a founding pastor of Faith at Work Christian Church in Co-op City, sustaining the ministry for almost 19 years with over 30 years of youth development experience, which began as a child protective services caseworker. I took the time to go through those names and describe the individuals who are on this commission, because we need people from every walk of life. Reparations, again, is not just one thing. It has many levels to this. We need people who understand the impact of slavery and post-slavery on our economics, on our finances, on our mental health, on our physical health. We need people who are looking at every single aspect of slavery and the offspring of slavery that followed. So it is important to get a very diverse group of people to be on this commission, and I'm really proud of the selections, especially Dr. Daniels, who was my recommendation. And not just because, I just want to say this, Dr. Daniels is not new to this. Very few people were talking about reparations. And sometimes even people that looked like us laughed at us when we brought it up. But for decades, you've been constant and consistent, and I've been able to work with you, work with December 12th, and others who kept on bringing it back, kept on bringing it back, kept on bringing it back, because it was serious, and we're worthy, and it's something that we should have done and we're supposed to do. So thank you for keeping that issue on the front burner, making sure that people always paid attention to it. And then finally, we have a bill. It's the start, but it has begun. The first meeting of the commission is set to take place, as I mentioned before, 180 days from the effective date, and that will take on or about June 18th. I don't know if y'all have the date set yet. Not yet, but it'll be soon. And the commission has yet to meet or establish a public website or other equivalent presence. However, the recently enacted budget did put some money in there so they can begin making those plans now. The main purpose of the commission is to make a report based on their inquiry as well as public input. Although no set number of public hearings are required in the bill, the report is required 1 year after the first meeting of the commission. So approximately June 18th, 2025, we should have a report. The commission is given 9 specific duties, which with respect to undertaking their work. 1 through 6 are substantive and inform the work of the commission in terms of the findings, and 7 through 9 are about executing and presenting the findings. So 1, examine the institution of slavery, which existed within the state of New York and in the city of New York. The commission's examination shall include, but not be limited to, an examination of A, the capture and procurement of Africans. B, the transport of Africans to what is now known as New York City and New York State for the purpose of enslavement, including their treatment during transport. C, the sale and acquisition of Africans as chattel property in interstate and intrastate commerce, including the direct and indirect benefits that New York received from these economic relationships. D, the treatment of enslaved Africans in the city of New York and the state of New York, including the deprivation of their freedom, exploitation of their labor, and destruction of their culture, language, religion, and families. And E, the treatment of formerly enslaved Africans and their descendants in the city of New York and the state of New York during the period between the end of the Civil War to present day. The second duty is to examine the extent to which the federal government, as well as the state and local governments of New York, supported the institution of slavery, including the extent to which such governments prevented, opposed, or restricted efforts of freed enslaved Africans to repatriate to their homeland. Third duty is to examine how New York State engaged in the interstate transfer of enslaved Africans and carried out federal policies in the furtherance of slavery. And the fourth duty, to examine the de jure and the de facto discrimination against freed enslaved Africans, their descendants, and people of African descent generally, at both the state and federal levels of government during the period between the end of the Civil War and the present, including but not limited to economic, political, educational, and social discrimination. And fifth duty is to examine the lingering negative effects of the institution of slavery and discrimination on living people of African descent and on society in the state of New York. The sixth duty, that was the sixth. That's the sixth duty is to examine the current condition of those, right, I did that. And then 7 is to recommend appropriate ways to educate the public. So 1 through 6 are the substantive duties of the commission. 7 through 9 are gonna be how they report it and how it's released. So the 7th is to recommend appropriate ways to educate the public of the commission's findings. And 8 is to recommend appropriate remedies and reparations in consideration of the commission's findings on the matters described in 1 through 6 of this subdivision, to determine how the state of New York may provide for appropriate laws, policies, programs, projects, and other recommendations in order to reverse such injuries. Such remedies may include compensation, including but not limited to the amount of compensation and who should be eligible for such compensation. And 9, examine the feasibility for the creation of a bureau to assist in the distribution and administration of remedies and reparations as recommended by the commission. I wanted you to hear all of that because reparations is a word to some people, and they have to understand all the details that are involved, all that's necessary, and all that's gonna be required. We need to start preparing. We need those of us who have to get our history together, get your history together, start getting it together. Those of you who need to bring testimony to help us, bring testimony. All of you who are knowledgeable, bring your intellect, bring your history, bring everything that you know, because we're gonna need it. Because you know what? Just to hear somebody tell me that there wasn't reparations in New York, it's not only that person that thinks, slavery in New York, it's not only that one person. That really is what some people think. And not all of them are white people. Some of them are other people who don't know that. So we have to educate our own community, educate ourselves to understand what it was, figure out all the things that have impacted your life and your family's lives, and we have to be ready to show up. We got through part one, but there's a lot of parts left to this. And I want us to be up on it, but I'm just thankful. John, thank you so much for putting this together. I know it wasn't easy, and I didn't expect the budget to take this long. But you did it, and I appreciate you. All the sponsors here today, Golden Krust, thank you. And thank you for doing this, and I look forward to there being many, many more of these. You know, I learned, Ron talked about Queen Mother Moore. I knew her a little. I got to see her a few times, but my teacher was Elambe Braff. And I remember just a little pre-adult, just learning about apartheid, just learning what had happened in the world. Like, no, that doesn't happen anymore. And I remember how I felt so let down by this public school system that had never taught us anything about our culture, globally or locally, other than we were slaves. That's all we knew. And that's so harmful. That's so harmful to us. So we have a lot of catching up to do. We have a lot of catching up of our family and neighbors to do. And let's go out there and do it. And as was said already, up you mighty race. Thank you.
Thank you so much to the State Senator. We're very fortunate. This event is being held under the patronage of the State Senator, and we're grateful for her support. And we've got some terrific support from folks throughout the community. Of course, the National African American Reparations Commission has been a big supporter of this event. The UNIA-ACL of Jamaica, a big supporter of the event. And one of the other supporters is our good friends from the Black Star News, which is one of the leading investigative journals in the city of New York. And we have not done enough, never can do enough to recognize the ancestors. And so we'll call on Mr. Milton Almaty to please grace us with another libation for the ancestors. Mr. Milton Almaty from the Black Star News. He's getting his stuff together. While he's getting his stuff together, I'll recognize our good brother Padmore John, who also organized much of what's happening here today. He is the owner and proprietor, along with his wife BJ, of the Zion Cafe in Sugar Hill, as well as a scientist, and I don't know what Padmore doesn't do, but he's always busy and active. We also were very fortunate to have, I'm not sure, there's another sponsor here on Yellow Block. Steve, I don't know if there's somebody here from Yellow Block that we want to recognize. And
I don't see him yet.
Okay, and then of course our friends from Golden Krust. But Brother Almaty, you ready? All right.
In fact, I'm wondering why I'm doing this when I see our esteemed elder, Professor Dr. Jeffries, in the house. Another round of applause for Professor Jeffries.
Use water instead.
Yeah. I don't know, we'll put it in that. All right, so fellow African peoples, as you know, libation, honoring our ancestors, is very important. So as I pour, you can invoke the name of any one of our great ancestors, and when somebody calls out their name, everyone else says, Ashe. So since I'm holding this, I will do the first honors.
Brother Milton, can we suggest that in the presence of libations that brothers and sisters stand? Because we are.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for that.
Who was able, of course.
Yes. So Professor Jeffries, you can sit. You have special dispensation. So I will start with Marcus Garvey.
Ashe.
The floor is open. Ashe.
Harriet Tubman,
Ashe.
Ida B. Wells,
Ashe.
Queen Mother Audley Moore.
Ashe. Kwame Nkrumah.
Shake.
Ashe.
Adam Clayton Powell.
Shake.
Ashe.
Steve Biko.
Steve Biko, yes, Ashe. Julius Nyerere.
Yes.
Ashe.
Maurice Bishop.
Ashe. Winnie Mandela.
Ashe.
Ashe.
Amy Garvey.
Ashe.
Fannie Lou Hamer.
Ashe. Nelson Mandela.
Ashe.
Ashe. Savannah Michelle.
Ashe.
Ashe. Amilcar Cabral.
Ashe.
Ashe.
Patrice Lumumba,
Patrice Lumumba, of course. Ashe.
Shake.
Padmore. Dessalines.
Haile Selassie,
Selassie. Ashe.
Sojourner Truth.
Sojourner Truth. Ashe. Let's have some more sisters, please.
Nani of the Maroons.
Ashe. Ya Asantewa.
Ashe.
Abdaraya Toya.
Ashe.
William Zinga of Angola.
Yes. Ashe.
Nana of the Maroons, yes?
Nana of the Maroons.
Ashe.
Nani of the Maroons.
Empress Taitu Betul.
Ashe.
Ashe. Ashe. Malcolm X. Ashe. One more sister. One more sister warrior.
Did we say Harriet Tubman already?
No, we didn't.
Okay, I was just trying to check.
Ashe. Okay, give yourself a round of applause, sister and brothers. Thank you so much. Blessings, peace and live. Adulta continua, eso va Michelle used to say.
Blessings. Thank you, brother. Much appreciated. Now, I do want to recognize we've had some folks that were very, willing to travel. Had folks travel, Brother Reverend Little and Brother Henry Young traveled from Baltimore. Our good friend Brian Chambers, artist and entrepreneur, traveled from Jersey. I'm sure some other people traveled. I've had some friends I haven't had the pleasure to meet yet. I heard travel from New Orleans. Welcome. Of course, Jason. Of course, Stephen traveling from Jamaica. The Yellow Block is the. Okay, sir. We did shout you out. One of our other sponsors from Yellow Block, of Bread and Breakfast. So, where is your bed and breakfast located?
We're in Brooklyn and Bedford.
Okay.
Bedford and Quincy.
All right. So, if anybody's looking for a bed and breakfast, please see the gentleman from Yellow Block.
And I was born in New Orleans.
Okay, there you go. All the connections. Our brother Shoko Chain traveled from Midtown, so you get a shout out because we love you. But speaking of Brooklyn, our next speaker actually didn't have to travel as far. Some of you others, but they did also come from Brooklyn. So please welcome our next speaker, Dr. Mrs. Laura Trevelyan. Laura?
Thank you so much, and thank you for the Golden Krust for the incredible breakfast. Thank you so much to the State Senator's Office for hosting this event, and thank you to Stephen for this invitation for me to speak. So Marcus Garvey said, as you all know, that a people without knowledge of their history, origin and culture is like a tree without roots. Marcus Garvey was speaking about the tragedy of the African diaspora and its fragmentation through the transatlantic slave trade. But he might as well have been speaking about the British and their complicity in the slave trade. and I stand before you as a descendant both of one of the most famous historians in Britain in the first half of the 20th century and as a descendant of enslavers in the British Caribbean. My great-grandfather, George Macaulay Trevelyan, was the best-selling historian in the first half of the 20th century. His English social history was a set text throughout Britain. In fact, Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, who we've been hearing about, the Vice-Chancellor of the University of the West Indies, the Chair of CARICOM's Reparations Commission, author of the seminal book, Britain's Black Debt. When I first met Sir Hilary, he couldn't stop laughing because there was a dark irony to the fact that I was interviewing him for a BBC documentary. When George Macaulay Trevelyan wrote his English social history, he celebrated William Wilberforce, who was an abolitionist in Britain in the 19th century. And that's really all that people in Britain, until very recently, were taught about the transatlantic slave trade, was that in 1833 we abolished it. We led the world. We were ahead of those terrible Americans, without actually any acknowledgement of the fact that British America was part of the empire, and indeed we the British introduced slavery here. So this collective amnesia is really summed up, I would say, in my own family, because George Macaulay Trevelyan, himself a descendant of enslavers who couldn't possibly have not known, because it was so soon after the time that he was writing that slavery had been in the family. There's no mention anywhere in English social history or in any of his other best-selling texts of the fact that he's a descendant of enslavers. He writes the national narrative that celebrates William Wilberforce and abolition. That abolition is one of the great achievements of 19th century Britain, not the horrors that went before, or indeed the horrors that came after emancipation, which was, as so many have noted, freedom in name only. But such is the amnesia that me, a journalist and a writer myself growing up, had no idea about the association of our ancestors with slavery until good old-fashioned data came into play in 2016, when University College London, in a groundbreaking project, they put online all of the compensation records of the money that was paid to Britain's enslavers in 1834 when slavery was abolished, in compensation for the loss of what was termed their property, because that is how the African Americans enslaved in the British Caribbean were regarded. So it wasn't the enslaved who were given compensation, it was their enslavers, because this was the only way to get abolition through Britain's Parliament. Such was the power of what was known euphemistically as the West India Lobby. And there's a very, very good book that came out recently in Britain called The Interest, all about the power of the West India Lobby, which is great. No longer is English social history the defining record of 19th century Britain. Now we have all these books coming out, like The Interest, which tell the real story of what happened, which is it was about money. So in 2016, when these compensation records were published by University College London, a very important project which had begun around the time of the 2007 bicentennial celebrations of the abolition of the slave trade. Slavery itself was not abolished in the British Empire until 1834. So UCL began to think about this 200th anniversary and what did it mean, the abolition of the slave trade? So all of this data comes out, and guess what? All of these families who received compensation in 1834, quite a lot of them are still part of Britain's elite landed gentry to this day. David Cameron, the Prime Minister of Britain, now the Foreign Secretary, has several relatives who are involved on both sides of his family. Charlie Gladstone, now a colleague of mine in this reparatory justice initiative, he's a descendant of the 19th century Prime Minister of Britain, William Gladstone, whose father, John Gladstone, was one of the biggest enslavers in the British Caribbean and introduced not just slavery, but indentureship to Guyana, so a twin legacy. So what does one do with this information in 2016, which is really beginning to make Britain question its identity, its legacies, its privilege? It was hard to know for me. I was here in the States, anchoring for the BBC. Donald Trump was elected that year. There was a lot going on. There was a lot to do. So I sat with the information as you do, and I sifted through it, and then that summer of 2020, with the protests in the wake of George Floyd's death, I began to really think, what did it mean if a legacy of slavery in America is police brutality towards black men? What was the legacy of slavery in Grenada, where my ancestors were absentee slave owners? What was the debate in Grenada as these images went around the world of George Floyd? So I persuaded my bosses at the BBC to let me go to Grenada to make a documentary about reparations, about the debate in the Caribbean, about CARICOM's 10-point plan, and I used my own family history, the fact that my ancestors had owned 10 different plantations in Grenada and received all this, not only so much money from the sugar trade, but also the compensation money as a way into the debate. And my dear boss at the BBC said, Laura, you can only go if you ask every single person that you meet, should I apologise as a descendant of enslavers, and should I pay reparations, and what does everybody think? So I asked everybody that question, and the answer that came back resoundingly was yes, you can apologise on behalf of your ancestors, and yes, you can pay reparations. And while I was in Grenada, I learned so much about the legacies of slavery today. I learned about the legacies of ill health, of obesity, hypertension, diabetes, the lack of investment in education, healthcare, how the legacies of poverty and illiteracy, lack of land ownership, even 200 years later, were reverberating through. And then you have climate change. Nobody in the Caribbean asked to be there. Their ancestors were kidnapped and dumped there. And now as P.J. Patterson, where I'm honoured to be a fellow at P.J.'s Institute at the University of the West Indies, an honorary fellow, P.J. said, the same winds which brought our ancestors to these islands now threaten us with winds and storms, which is a very contemporary and threatening legacy, I would argue, of slavery. So I worked with leaders in Grenada, with Sir Hilary Beckles. Hilary said, Laura, your family can apologise and you can set an example. Because if a family can apologise and pay reparations, so can governments. So Hilary, really working with us and with Grenadian leaders, adapted CARICOM's 10-point plan. Point 1 is an apology. Investment in health and education, debt forgiveness is part of the plan. So all of us working together under Hilary's leadership and guidance, we adapted that. And so in February last year, we became the first family in the British Caribbean, descended from enslavers, to go to an island and to publicly apologise in an event that was organised. We apologise for what our ancestors did to the ancestors of the people of Grenada, and we acknowledge that nothing could ever make up for the loss and the horror and the death, the lives that weren't lived, the potential that wasn't fulfilled. And at the beginning of the event, there was a very moving exhibit organised by Grenada's National Museum, by the curator Angus Martin, and it was the names of the 1,000 enslaved Africans owned by the Trevelyan family at abolition. So the names and the ages were written on pieces of card, and they were held up for all of us to see. And my stepmother, who was there, who was 72 at the time, she looked at this tree and she saw the name of Julia from the Beausejour plantation, who was 72 at so-called emancipation, and she cried to think of the fate of the Julia that was not her. So after our apology, and I donated £100,000 towards education in Grenada, and that money is with Grenada's National Reparations Committee by the University of the West Indies, all kinds of things really changed in my life. So many people got in touch from really all over the world to say, I'm a descendant of an enslaver in New Zealand, I'm in France, what do I do? And so with 7 other people in Britain, we set up just a very loose grouping called Heirs of Slavery, specifically to highlight the fact that we were people whose ancestors had profited from slavery, to underline that point. And we called on Britain's government to apologise for slavery and to negotiate with CARICOM on the basis of its 10-point reparations plan. And I've worked subsequently with other families who want to publicly apologise, to engage in reparation strategies, And that's how I met Stephen Golding in Jamaica last year, because Stephen very kindly let this lady who'd been a BBC journalist and had announced that she was leaving her job to join the Caribbean's fight for reparatory justice, somewhat unlikely, you might say. But Stephen kindly met with me and has been such an ally in all of this. And in Britain, thank you, Stephen. In Britain, this is a big year too. There probably will be a change of government. The King of England has said that he's seeking to deepen his understanding of the legacies of slavery. He's a constitutional monarch, so he can't go ahead of the government of the day. The current Conservative government of Britain is not interested in reparations or apology. But if there were to be a change in government, the next Foreign Secretary would be David Lammy, most likely, who would be British Guyanese, a child of the Caribbean, someone who's written widely about the harms of slavery that are felt to this day in modern Britain, someone with close ties still to Guyana. A change in government could afford the King the opportunity to follow in the footsteps of the Dutch King and to apologise for the very well documented links of the Royal African Company to the slave trade at its inception. So things are changing, you can feel it. In France at the weekend in Nantes, the Atlantic port that was so involved in the slave trade, there was a meeting convened by French descendants of enslavers and the enslaved to try to get a European community of all the heirs of slavery, heirs of enslavers and of the enslaved, to discuss the legacies, to discuss what to do. So in Britain, as all of you may know, the Windrush generation faced so much discrimination when they went to Britain, succeeded against all the odds, only in 2010 to find themselves the victims of a hostile environment, a hostile immigration policy that Britain's government imposed, and people who didn't have proper documentation after years in the country were deported. And this too is a legacy of slavery, but it's poorly understood in Britain how Windrush is associated with slavery, that people came from what Britain's Prime Minister Lloyd George called the slums of empire to Britain because they had no choice. There were no jobs in the West Indies. So there's much that is being unravelled. So I've talked for too long, but I just want to let you know that there is a growing reparatory justice movement. People have written to me and said, where are the American heirs of slavery? And I think it's a good question. But I did see a very good documentary recently on PBS called The Cost of Inheritance, which showed women, it's interesting that it's women, isn't it? Women descended from enslavers working with descendants of those who their ancestors had enslaved on very local strategies of repair. So I think there's a growing awakening. I wait with great interest to see what New York's Reparations Commission can come up with, and I will just finish by saying that Professor Sir Hilary Beckles made a speech here in New York in September, and he said the reparatory justice movement will be the greatest of the 21st century because it's about love and compassion and healing. And that's how I see it. I don't myself see it as being an issue about race. I think it's about justice at its core. I know it's easy for me to say that it's not an issue of black and white, but I believe the compelling argument of justice, of a debt that is due, is one that as generations grow up and are educated about what really happened, which is now happening in America and in Britain and in Europe, a more diverse population will be more receptive to understand what really happened and more sympathetic to the idea that we have to confront these legacies if we are to move forward. So thank you so much for listening to me, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much, Laura. Very much appreciated. And thank you for your time and your commentary. One of the things that it's important for us to know that this lecture series is not just for our own edification and knowledge and growth, but the symposium is also to serve as an annual fundraiser for the Garvey School in the Bronx. And there's not only one Garvey School in the country, there are several. There's one in Detroit, two in LA, I think it says here, and there's one in Nigeria and two in Jamaica. So there are Garvey schools around the world. We are fortunate today, before we have another sample of music from our expert drummer, to have the principal of the Garvey School in the Bronx, June O'Connor. So June, if you want to come up and say a couple words about your school, and then introduce Atiba for another musical selection before we get to the keynote address and wrap up the day.
Thank you. A very good morning to everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Indeed, I'm honored to be among an esteemed group of advocates and agitators who are ensuring the protection of our history. And also, this is such an important reminder, and thank you, Stephen Golding, for inviting me to be a part of this effort to educate our children, because the unattended frontier right now is education. And so we are extremely concerned that unless we educate our children in their history, then we will be gone, and then who will continue? Because our children really don't know the history. And I will tell you very quickly that when it was time to place my daughter in a learning environment, and I went on the search, I was really distressed and discouraged by what was available. It was such an unequal existence for learning within the system. And I thought, this is not what I will allow my daughter to learn, because it's not empowering. And a long time ago, my grandmother told me, she said, what you're offered is not what you have to take. And so I believe that's what the system offered. And my response was, no, thank you. So I went about to educate my daughter, and in that search, I realized the embedded inequities in the system. It's something that we have to change. And I will quickly also share with you Freire, a Brazilian author. When he examined education in Brazil, which you know that's where the largest population of Black people are outside of Africa, he said there is something about what the teachers do and our expectation of them, that the expectations are unrealistic because our oppressors have written the textbooks and provided the content. And so therefore we should not expect our teachers to be able to impart empowering information because it's not there. And that's how the Garvey School came about. I decided to teach my daughter about her history first, recognize her academic excellence and how I can support that. And in that, my friends and neighbors, what are you doing with your daughter? I said, it's a long story, but I'm on this journey. And before long, there were 75 children in my living room because there were other families who had that need. And so as we do this, it's a very lonely experience to build, as you know, because there's not embedded support for a Pan-Africanist view of education for our children. And so even though, yes, I got my daughter to the point where she was, invited and admitted into one of these premier independent schools, which, as you know, is very Eurocentric. But as attentive as I was, I ensured that she knew her history. And that's what we all have to do. So I'm hoping, and I'm inviting you to our next fundraising effort. With your permission, I'll put the flyers out there. That is the frontier that is open now, that we have to fill. I think it's unreasonable for us to expect our oppressors to empower our children. I think it's illogical for us to expect our oppressors to write content that will empower and inform our children and prepare them to be vanguards of their history. It's not their responsibility at all. And so in finding out that my daughter's experience would not be included in these exclusive schools, those schools were not created for our children. I accept that. But I believe now that we have an opportunity, that we're sufficiently educated, that we're sufficiently resourced, that collectively we can build that school within our own community.
You're right.
And I'm exceptionally focused on having the same quality, the same status quo of school within our own community. Because what is happening now is a brain drain, right? Very early. Because in my early investigations, I was pointing to the early steps, ABC, A Better Chance, Prep for Prep, and I looked at those programs, and I said, no. If she's capable, why does she need the extra hoops? And so as I was as bold as I was naive, and I went to one of those schools and I asked, what would my granddaughter need to be in here? And they gave me the information, you know, she has to be well-rounded, exposed, high-performing, and we understand that your community is not as well-resourced or exposed to the rigor of the expectations here. So, you know, the ABC and the da-da-da-da. And I said, well, then it seems to me the problem is that our children should have the foundation in their community because it's not cognitive skills, right? So if that's not the issue, then the issue is resources misplaced or manipulated in a way. And so once our children are prepared, then they're siphoned off into those communities, and it seems like bright black kids only happen outside of our community. And so that's why I think it's so important for us to make an effort to determine, to resolve that the independent school that we all rush to, because that's where the resources are, we should build that school in our own community. And we should be the ones to do that. And we would curate the content, and we would train our teachers, because our teachers mostly now have been miseducated in the system. And again, we continue that legacy of miseducation. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to address you, and please support the Garvey School. We owe it to us to educate our children. I'm going to ask Brother Atiba, and whenever I get a microphone before I leave, I always ask everyone to join me. I will say it twice, and then you say it, and you raise the roof saying, "Up, you mighty race. You can accomplish what you will."
Up, you mighty race. You can accomplish what you will.
You don't sound mighty enough. I want you to say it with such conviction that our ancestors, 5 generations back, hear it. Let's try it again.
Up, you mighty race. You can accomplish what you will.
I think we're getting it. Brother Atiba, thank you so much. He's one of the important griots in our history, and he curates the music, and this is how he's telling the story. And he will always be at my events, because we need to hear and we need to see. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. The one thing, the word griot is a French mispronunciation of the Williford gobble. They couldn't say gobble, so they said griot. But griot is a French word. Wolof, we say gobble. Man gobble la fille, I am gobble here. Okay? So the tradition of abolition began on that continent. So Sumangoro was one of the great abolitionists. He's the one who preceded Sunjata in the creation of the Great Mali Empire. And he fought against the invaders who were coming from the east as well as from the west. And so then Sunjata, as the elected king of Mali, the elected Mansa, because they say Mansa, of Mali. And so the song that I'm going to share with you and go into a poem is one of the first songs in terms of anthems that was created for Mali. We had abolition. We had anthems. We had everything. We had schools. The University of Sankora in Mali was there in Timbuktu, where one's wealth was determined on how many books we had in our libraries.
Oh, yes.
The word paper comes from papyri. Our ancestors created paper. Papyri is a grass that grows on the Hopi River. And so now it's called the Nile. So the reason I started the program earlier with is because our children and our us, we still have issues singing our traditional languages. You know, so when I ask people to come and sing with me, you know, we kind of like, is it okay? But our children are doing that as well. You know, so that's why it's important, as said, you know, we have to bring it to our children.
That's right.
You know, if we want our children to appreciate jazz and reggae and samba and merengue, which is from Haiti. A lot of people think it's from the Dominican Republic, but merengue is actually from Haiti. All right. So these kind of musics are African musics. These are African musics, and so this song, Olaibo Mansanya Ningalebo Laila Simbo Mansanya Elaila. This song, here is a song of kings and queens. The jelly sings while traveling. Listen close, this message brings. Wumo jam, holaibo mansanya, ningalebo laila, simbo mansanya, elaila. Dream of a journey truly grand, like Mansa Musa across the sand. With thousands more, they had a plan. Wumo jam, holaibo mansanya, ningalebo laila, simbo mansanya, elaila. Yes, we proclaim and Zinga too, with Sundiata leaders who made a way for me and you. Wumo jam, holaibo mansanya, ningalebo laila, simbo mansanya, elaila. They knew that we are family, each one plays a part, you see, if we're to change reality. Wumo jam, holaibo mansanya, ningalebo laila, simbo mansanya, elaila. We are sons of the sun, yes, daughters of the moon. Oceans and rivers reflect us. The wind is our voice, the breeze our whisper. Silence, even silence respects us. It is we who decided the day is divided into what's now understood as the hour. We built a sphinx and pyramids as links to great ancestral power. We created mountains, the canyon's abyss, the falcon, our symbol of light, soars above high in the clouds where even darkness is bright. We charted the movements of planets and stars, employed them as yearly planners, labeled beasts mighty and small, studied their every manner. We are the elephants, Blair, the lion's roar that filled the forest with wonder. We are the cascading sound of the Great Lake Falls, known as a house of thunder. Count the sand of Sahara, the drops of the Nile, the savannah's every blade of grass. Only then will you see the greatness achieved by those of Africa's past. Yes. Count the sand of Sahara, the drops of the Nile, the savannah's each and every blade of grass. Only then will you see the greatness achieved by those of Africa's past. We are Venda, Fulani, Hausa, Igbo, Wolof, Serer, Ga. We are Zulu, Manding, Ashanti Dogon, Yoruba, Maasai, Twa, Nunyukwa African, Nunyukwa African, Todos Negros and Amunos and Africanos, Todos Negros and Amunos and Africanos. We are Africans. We are Africans. We are Africans.
Thank you so much, brother, for bringing the drums and the spirit. And you guys have all been wonderful. You know, I've been very blessed. I was raised in consciousness. You know, my father Morris Braffett was a black artist in Guyana and was a proponent of black theater in Guyana, moving away from, traditional theater to cultural theater. My uncle Ivor Phillips was a diehard Pan-Africanist. My two other uncles, Trevor and Michael Phillips, wrote the book Windrush and talked about exactly what Laura was talking about in writing. And one of my uncles, Ron Bob Semple, embodied the spirit of Marcus Garvey better than probably anybody I'd ever seen. He's with the ancestors now too, so I have to shout him out. But whenever I think of Garvey, I think of my uncle. I always love, look for me in the whirlwind, and I don't think there's any better line that describes our brother Stephen Colton, because he is truly the whirlwind. He will not be deterred, and it's such a pleasure to be in association with him and to learn from him over the years. And so without further ado, our keynote speaker, Stephen Golden.
Thank you, Marcel. Morning, everyone.
Morning.
It's still morning. How was breakfast?
Good.
You can't go wrong with a Jamaican breakfast in the morning. I want to thank you all for coming. I want to, of course, thank State Senator Cleare for hosting us. This is the third in what is really a global series that began in January this year in Western Jamaica, where Garvey gave his last big public lecture in the parish of Hanover, as we were talking about, Laura, before migrating to the United States. In March, we did one in Atlanta, which commemorated his first mass public lecture in America. Not his first in America, but his first one with an audience of over 300 at Big Bethel AME. And we had an excellent turnout for that. This one, of course, is very special to me. Not only was I a resident here in Harlem for many years, but Harlem is really the place. New York City is the city that built Marcus Garvey. We birthed him in Jamaica, but he became the icon of the 20th century that he now is from the work that he did primarily from this city. So he first spoke in New York City at the St. Mark's Church on 138th, not far from here, on May 9th, 1916. And so when we had the opportunity to do this memorial lecture on that particular date, it made it even that more significant. This is the first one we're doing as a breakfast, and I knew that would have been challenging in terms of, the amount of people who would be able to make it, but I forget which one of the Christ said that, when one or two are gathered in my name. So I'm going to be brief this morning. I like to talk about Marcus Garvey a lot, but in the interest of time, I just want to situate why we chose the theme of Reparations Now for this lecture. And many people are not familiar with the history of Marcus Garvey in terms of the reparations movement. But I heard a few names called today that are very much connected. The month of May really should be branded as Africa Month because there's so many significant dates in there. In fact, a week ago on May 2nd marked the passing of Queen Mother Audley Moore. Queen Mother Audley Moore, who is known as the African-American mother of the reparations movement, in her own testimony spoke about the impact that seeing Marcus Garvey speak in New Orleans. And let me shout out my sisters who are visiting from the NOLA here. Came all the way for this lecture. I'm so honored. I'm humbled. Queen Mother said, it was the impact of Garvey that really started her on the path of Black consciousness. And of course, she has made so much great contributions, as a part of the New Republic, the Republic of New Africa, but particularly as somebody who constantly brought the issue of reparations before the United Nations. And the reason she did that was directly following in the path of Marcus Garvey, who from the inception of the League of Nations in 1919, Garvey was part of a group of influential black people in America at the time that organized a delegation to attend the League. You know, the League of Nations came together after World War I with the purpose of preventing there being any other world wars, meaning nations of the world needed a council that they could sit and heed the advice of each other, resolve conflicts. But in 1919, when that league was formed, there was no representative of the black people of the world. There was no African nation that was present because most of Africa, apart from one or two countries, and particularly the Empire of Ethiopia at that time, the other parts of Africa had been colonized by either the Portuguese, the Dutch, the Spanish, the British, the French. But this particular group, which met in New York City, comprised of Madam C.J. Walker. Tell me if you recognize these names. William Monroe Trotter. Ida B. Wells had an influence on that group coming together, and Marcus Garvey. They met at Madam C.J. Walker's villa, and they organized themselves first as a group called the League of Darker Peoples of the World. And the objective was to send a representative to the League of Nations to speak up on behalf and in the interest of the 400 million black people in the world at that time. Now here's where it gets tricky. Because as early as 1919, the reaction of the US government was to pull out all stops to prevent that delegation from appearing at the Paris Peace Conference. So they denied Madam C.J. Walker a passport, William Monroe Trotter a passport. Marcus Garvey's response was to deputize a young Haitian by the name of Eliezer Cadet to represent the delegation. So he made it to Paris, and how significant is it that at this first meeting of the League of Nations, the person sent to represent the interests of black people was a Haitian? Well, while the US was able to prevent the others from attending, when Cadet got there, the League itself said they would allow him to sit in the viewers gallery, but that he would not be seated as a delegate because he did not represent a particular member state. When word got back to Garvey, his response was within a year to organize here in Harlem, in New York City, the first international convention of the Negro peoples of the world, at which 2,500 delegates representing 2 million UNIA members around the world assembled at really what was the first plebiscite of black people in the diaspora. And they crafted in the space of 13 days, the first 13 days of August, a document known as the Declaration of Rights of the Negro peoples of the world. Garvey referred to it as the Magna Carta of our race. And it is so disturbing to me that it's a document that is still rarely taught about in schools. In fact, there should be a poster of it somewhere up in this state building. It predated the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by over 2 decades. And it should be looked at not just as a masterpiece in terms of race relations at the time, and a commentary on what black people were facing and what we were advocating for, but it really was part of the creation and understanding of what we now call today human rights. If you think about it, human rights was not defined until African people were challenged by a corrupt and oppressive system to prove their own humanity. And the legislation of several nations, not just in the United States, but across the whole British Empire, denied us our own humanity. What were we in the United States at one point? 3/5? So when Laura speaks about this not just being about race, she's absolutely right. Our struggle and our advocacy has defined what the world knows today in the 21st century as human rights. And people are quick to tell you about their human rights now. I mean, I'm an old school father. Sometimes when I want to get stern with my children, they're ready to tell me about child rights. So it's important that we recognize Garvey's contribution. Dr. Daniel spoke about the Rastafarians who for a long time have been saying, we are the ones who've been speaking about reparations for the longest, and they're not the only ones. But certainly, as Senator Cleare said earlier, there was a time where even amongst our own people, when you bring up reparations, there would be snickers. These guys can't be serious. Oh, them again. I'm tired of hearing this. It's ridiculous. It's never going to happen. Our generation lived that. And I'm amazed to see where we are today. And quite frankly, I agree with Sir Hilary Beckles, who says that the 21st century will be the time of the reparation movement and that it will be the greatest accomplishment of this 21st century. One more thing I want to say before I wrap up. Garvey not only was a trailblazer in terms of his advocacy at the international level, right? Because not only did he chase the League of Nations 1919, he sent another delegation in 1922, that one again led by another Haitian by the name of John Joseph Adams. But even up to 1945, after Garvey's death, the UNIA was present when the League of Nations, which had failed to prevent World War II, had to be dissolved and re-engineered as what we have today as the United Nations. We were present there at 1945, advocating for the rights and the interests of African people. And just not even a month ago, Reverend Little and myself spoke in Geneva at what is now known as the United Nations Permanent Forum for People of African Descent. So we went from in 1919 not having our delegate seated to in 2022 or 21, a permanent forum whose mission is to look out for and advocate for the interests of Africans at home and abroad, now exists at the United Nations. June was right when she spoke about the educational system. And one of the greatest challenges that we have to overcome, and it's the reason for those snickers and those jeers a decade ago, 2 decades ago, 3 decades ago, when reparation was mentioned. One of the things we have to overcome is, as Carter G. Woodson titled it, is the miseducation of the Negro. In fact, in the Declaration of Rights of the Negro People of the World, that document, that Magna Carta, that was produced at a convention and plebiscite chaired by the Right Excellent Marcus Mosiah Garvey. One of those declarations, apart from declaring the red, black, and green flag that Ron had, and a number of other things, one of those declarations, in fact, stated that as descendants, as African descendants, or as African people in general, that 1:31, we declare that the teaching in any school by alien teachers to our boys and girls that the alien race is superior to the Negro race is an insult to the Negro people of the world. And Declaration 49 says, we demand that instructions given Negro children in schools include the subject of Negro history to their benefit. This is absolutely important. And the reason why we wanted June up here representing for the Garvey School, and why it's so important that we do everything not only to strengthen the existence of these institutions, but to create more. Laura spoke about William Wilberforce, Granville Sharp. Even in our own educational system in Jamaica, we are taught a colonial narrative about the history of our ancestors. And to this day, we have not completely put together in terms of a teaching curriculum what young African descendants need to know and understand about the struggle of their ancestors and the reality of the creation of chattel slavery, not slavery, and how it institutionalized that horrid period, and the worst byproduct of that institutionalization, as was referred to earlier by Ron Daniels also, which is white supremacy, or the concept of white supremacy, which still infects many of our own people. I know when I say white supremacy, you think I'm talking about some white people maybe dressed in some sheep and you know. No. White supremacy is still prevalent within the minds of our own people.
Right.
And we have to blame the educational system, which fails to address that. One of the things that absolutely must be addressed, and I believe will do away with the naysayers, the black people who believe that talking about reparations is akin to us begging people for money, or people thinking this is just about money. And don't get me wrong, this is very much about the issue of wealth and wealth creation, as much as it is about reparatory justice. But there is a definition in the dictionary when you look up reparations. And oftentimes I realize that our narrative, as this movement picks up momentum, tends a little bit towards one definition. The first one, which says that reparation is the action of making amends for a wrong one has done by providing payment or assistance to those who have been wronged. But here's a second definition. And the second definition says it is the compensation for war damage paid by a defeated state. The colonial narrative says we sold each other in Africa, and we went willingly into slavery, and we accepted our roles, house Negro, field Negro, and that we waited patiently for Europe to grow a conscience and have a heart. And when they finally did, we celebrated our emancipation at their hands. You laugh. Jamaican history books talk about William Wilberforce, but only within the last decade have we been able to put other names in that narrative. One of them being Oluwado Equiano. You ever heard of this man? Yeah. Or the Sons of Africa. And the story goes deeper than that, because I've said to people, you know what is interesting in terms of the narrative of how slavery existed in Africa? Do you know of any major slave uprising in the history of Africa? Apart from Moses and the Exodus out of Egypt. Can anyone recall? I'm not saying they may not have been. But if Africa was so prevalent in this slavery, this type of slavery, listen, the first recorded revolt of the enslaved Africans in the Americas happened in 1522. Chattel slavery became commercialized in the Kingdom of Congo, not the Congo that we know today, in the 1490s, round about the same time that Christopher Columbus was coming here to discover where people were living already. On his nephew's plantation in 1522, when the Europeans now began to apply their system of chattel slavery, the only form of slavery that dehumanizes the enslaved and enslaves even the fetus within the womb of the mother, when that fetus sometimes was even the child of the enslaver. This is how horrid that system was. But the first revolt against it took place within less than a generation of the plantation system starting. That means from the very beginning, Africans did not recognize this form of slavery as something familiar to them in Africa. In fact, by the 1530s, and if you look into the records of the Catholic Church, there's a letter from the Mani Congo, which is the King of Kings of the Congo Empire, to the Portuguese king, saying that your slave traders are violating our treaties and agreements. They are no longer purchasing enslaved from the proper channels and the proper markets, because slavery was a penal system of Africa. We didn't build prisons to put people and feed them. You committed a crime, you were a prisoner of war, you owed a debt to society, you worked that debt off by a system of enslavement. But that system did not seek to make you the property of someone that could will you in perpetuity to their descendants until you die. There's a letter from the Mani Congo saying this thing has gone wrong. They're now kidnapping women and children. In fact, they kidnapped some of my own relatives, and you better go to Brazil and find them wherever they are. Send no more slave traders. Throughout the Americas and everywhere the plantation system happened, they were champions who fought against slavery. In fact, there are statues to them in these places, but the narrative that we get doesn't highlight these stories. There's Gaspar Yanga in Mexico. There's Bencos Bioho in Colombia. There's Ganga Zumba and Zumbi in Brazil. There's Makanda in Haiti, Nani, Kojo, Achompong, and Kwao in Jamaica. We resisted on the continent, we resisted in the slave ships, we resisted in the plantations, we fought from the hills, and we fought and we won that war. There are treaties written by the Portuguese, the Spanish, the British, and the French, who refused to use the treaty method and thought they could stay the course in the war, were defeated twice in Haiti. The point I'm making is that when we learn our history in pockets, there were Seminoles in this country, black Seminoles, who fought against slavery. Gabriel Prosser, when they managed to subdue his rebellion, discovered that his plans, once they had defeated the enemy, was to head to Haiti. But they teach you your history separate than how they teach me mine in Jamaica. But if we take a page from Garvey's book and examine not his story but our story through the spectacles of Pan-Africanism, what we will realize is that there was a war fought. Many battles in many theaters, with many generals and many captains. And there were more victories than defeats in those battles. And it culminated with Europe having to end the system of chattel slavery. So when we think about reparations, it should not be in the context of, oh, we were wrong, then you owe us. The fact is, when you win a war, reparations is the natural course of action. The person who loses the war has to pick up the tab and pay the debt of what this war has inflicted. It was so in Ethiopia on May 5th, 1941. But this is the only war where the victors were made to compensate the losers. And I mean that in the fact, and this brings me back to the final point in terms of why this is about wealth creation and about control of wealth. What gave the reparation movement the recent momentum it has is the fact that in the case of the Caribbean, in 2015 there was a tweet by the British Treasury that said that the money that the British government had borrowed in 1834 to compensate not the enslaved, but the enslavers, had finally been paid off in 2015. They borrowed so much money to compensate the enslavers that they took out a loan that took them over 250 years to pay off. So it means that the Africans living in the UK, and particularly in Bristol, who've been paying their taxes, think about this, have been buying their ancestors out of slavery. Let that sit in your brain a little bit. We've been paying to free our ancestors in the past. And you want me to celebrate emancipation? This is what kicked over the, it was almost as powerful as the martyrdom of George Floyd. And the fact that we are still not settled with these outstanding issues in this generation. Even though we were not the ones in the field fighting the war, we're still feeling the effects and the anger. The dissatisfaction is there because of how that war was ended and because the terms of reparations were not agreed upon and settled. So when we talk about Garvey's and when we talk about reparations, I need you all to understand, this is not about charity. This is not about begging. This is about the fulfillment of something that was started by our ancestors 300 years ago. Something that we have a duty to fulfill. And something I say is the very reason we have to exist. I often tell school children when I end my lectures, get them to close their eyes and paint this picture of what it must have been like on a slave ship. And I'm not going to put you through that. It's a horrible thing to think about, but quite effective in getting school children to understand the seriousness. And it's not as pretty as it's written in the history books that don't really go into the deep trauma and horrors that our ancestors lived through, but they did. And if they didn't live, none of us would be sitting here today. And I asked them to think, why do you think they chose to live? Because some didn't. Don't get me wrong, that's another part of the journey. Some chose death. The story of the Zong, which started Equiano on his quest to petition the British government to end the slave trade. You hear what I said? The petition to end the slave trade was started by a black man. Wilberforce and Pitt were just young MPs looking for a platform to build their careers. If Equiano hadn't brought the insurance fraud of the Zong to them, maybe there would be some different names in our history book now. The Zong was the tragedy of the ineptitude of a slave captain that went off course, and by the time he came off course, they didn't think they had enough water to make the journey. The insurance policy they held said that if the enslaved Africans died from their neglect, they wouldn't pay out. But if they died from some other reason, sickness or so forth, they would pay out. And these sailors decided to jettison their cargo. And they threw overboard about 233 Africans. No, let me correct that. They threw over 122. 10 more, rather than suffer the indignity, chose to jump over themselves. And they're not the only ones. So the reason our ancestors chose to live was not because they thought, oh, Guyana's going to be a great place someday. Or no, Jamaica's, woo, sand sea. This is okay. None of them chose for that reason. They chose because they understand that they were in a war. And it was a war where your strategy necessarily may take you several generations to achieve the ultimate victory. This is why I say it may be the very reason we have to live. We were born for this purpose. The problem is somewhere along the way, we allowed the Muzungu's narrative. We allowed the colonial narrative to fool us, to make us forget, to make us disavow the mission that was left to us by our ancestors. Reparations is the culmination of this war for the satisfaction of the sacrifices of our ancestors. And if we deny them and deny our very purpose in seeing this through to the end, we deny the very reason that we exist. Take this thing very seriously. And it's going to take all of us working together. We don't need to hear about who's been saying this the longest, who just come along. I know civil society talk about the hurry come up politicians, the senator is gone yet, it's gone. They have a role to play as much as civil society has a role to play. The schools have a role to play. The parents have a role to play. The community has a role to play. The journalists have a role to play. And Laura is right, it's not just about black and white. We need allies in the fight for justice. We need allies to make the world remember. This is our mission. This is our charge. I want to thank you all for coming out today. We want to do this every year in recognition of the right excellent Marcus Mosiah Garvey. One God, one aim, one destiny. Thank you.
Thank you. Another round of applause for Stephen Golden. And then we're going to have Brother Patmore to say a couple words in closing, and then we'll conclude our program. Brother Patmore, now.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. We appreciate your presence, your opening up your ears, opening up your minds and hearts, and your dedication to the cause. This is not the end. This is just the beginning. I want you to just consider this. In the mid-90s, Chase Bank came out with a study. And they said that they conducted a study to look at the cost of racism. They put it at over $2.9 trillion over a 60-year period. What the cost of racism did to GDP of the US, okay? $2.9 trillion. There was a study that was done by Duke University that looked at the impact of not the concept of redlining, just in the city of Chicago, from the mid-40s to the mid-70s, over $10 billion that was removed from the African American community to the white community. So all of these are showing, and these are studies not coming from folks that look like you and me, but from Chase Bank, Duke University. So there is, so just imagine that it was just Chicago, so just imagine if you were doing it at all the different cities across America that were redlined. And I would just want to say my background is in public health. Today, if you look at the majority of places, especially in New York City, and I'm quite sure it's in other cities as well, when you look at the impact of redlining, those places, those parts of the city that was most redlined, you will see that those same spaces 100 years later are typically the places where you have the most negative health outcomes, substance abuse problems, overweight, obesity, go down the lines, the highest mortality and negative outcomes for those individuals in those spaces. So when we're talking about reparations, yes, it is about wealth, generation of wealth, but it is about addressing all of those impacts on society and our service that has been so negatively affected by the legacy of white supremacy. So, what is our takeaway? We are here, we've listened, there's some who are working, dedicated on this. We need to be part of this wholeheartedly. We need to support the schools that are giving out that information. We need to support the newspapers and the writers who are putting out this information. We need to be part of the commission, listen to the commission, be parts of expressing our stories, and to be able to ensure that the decisions that are being made by the commission for the state of New York, the city of New York, are based on what we, as the descendants of our great ancestors, are living through today on a daily basis. I thank you so much for being here. We will continue to have this conversation. We will continue to, again, bring this here next year. It may not be necessary in this occasion, but this is something we're being committed to. And say thank you for Golden Krust. Thank you for Yellow Block. Thank you for our MC, for our ancestors that I heard today, for the great speakers, for you all, and we'll continue being in contact with you. Thank you so much.
Before we go, we want to ask all of the program participants to come up front so that we can take a picture, and we'd like Dr. Jeffries, if you'd be our honored guest in that photograph. The senator had to leave because of pressing commitments, but I want everybody who lives here in New York to hold this Reparations Commission accountable. This Reparations Commission, the work that the senator and Brother Padmore and Brother Braithwaite and others have done is so important, but it's not enough to create the vehicle. We have to make sure that the vehicle does what it's supposed to do and goes where it's supposed to go. You heard that the commission is charged with studying a number of things, but there's one thing that I want to pull out that must be studied. Yes, there was slavery in New York, but the fact of the matter is that the state of New York and the city of New York are what enabled the entirety of slavery in the United States and also in the Caribbean to continue to exist. Because when these racist enslavers started going bankrupt and they needed money, the first financial products, the first derivatives were mortgages on enslaved people, mortgages on our ancestors. And which governments gave license to businesses to make loans on enslaved people? The governments of New York City and New York State. So you heard Brother Padmore referencing Chase Bank. before they sold securities on Wall Street, they sold Africans. And then the first securities that they sold on Wall Street were these financial products that they developed by offering mortgages on enslaved people and then bundling those mortgages and selling those bonds on the international financial market. And so we have to be very, very clear. It's not just that they did all these other things to us that they did, but then they created all of the wealth that they have today. There is no money in the world that is free of the taint of the blood of our ancestors, which was spilled because of slavery. And so in New York, on behalf of all African people who have been enslaved, you all have to continue to provide leadership to call to account the financial abuses that took place. I love it when white folks say, oh, well, my ancestor didn't own any slaves. We came here once slavery was over. My friend, your ancestors came here to enjoy the opportunity and wealth that was created by slavery. You and your ancestors are just as culpable as the people who held us in chains. And so the struggle continues. God bless. With all the participants.
Everybody.
After we do one with the panelists, we're going to have a group photo of everyone. Let's move quickly so that Dr. Jeffries doesn't have to stand long.
Should we do it over there?
Yeah, we don't want that flag in our picture.
I like that. I like that. I like it.